Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to the final class here. So, unlike other classes, let me just frame myself for a second. There we go. So, I think for somebody like Chaim Amsalem, as Rabbi Marsha said, this is probably the least well-known thinker. He's also the only thinker who is still alive on our list. And I think that there's a specific reason why he's perhaps not as well known as many of our other thinkers. I'm going to make a optimistic prediction that when the next iteration of this class happens in 50 years from now, when we're talking about great Jewish thinkers of the 21st century, I think the Jewish community would be very lucky to count somebody like Rabbi Amsalem as one of the hopeful great thinkers of the 21st century, because as we'll see, Rabbi Amsalem is at the intersection of some of the biggest issues in the Jewish world today, both politics, if we think of the interworkings of Israeli politics, we'll get to there in a few minutes, and also wider questions between the Jewish community about interaction between, say, different denominations, and the issue that I think is the singularly most divisive issue in the Jewish community. No, this is not the issue having to do with Israel or Zionism or how to solve anti-Semitism, but the question of Jewish identity and who do we consider Jewish by which standard. And we'll get to this at the end because this is a project that Rabbi Amsalem, along with others, has worked very difficult on. But I wanted to set a little bit of the framing, and then we're going to go and start at medieval history here. So this is going to be a little bit more of a walk through different historic sources to then culminate in our final argument. But I want to suggest, and I'm somebody who interestingly straddles both the Orthodox world and the American Jewish, non-Orthodox slash pluralistic world. And I think the biggest issue in the Jewish community in terms of wider unity for the Jewish people is this question of who do you consider Jewish and by what standard? And obviously this gets into the two main drop-down issues for that, which is one, standards of conversion. In other words, who decides what the standards are for somebody to be converted into Judaism? And the second, what happens in a situation where perhaps you have one Jewish parent and the other parent isn't Jewish, especially if the Jewish parent is a male, according to traditional Talmudic slash Orthodox law, Jewish identity, it is both necessary and sufficient unless one converts to have a Jewish mother. The Reform movement and the Reconstructionist movement in America has, in the last 40 years, also added patrilineal descent to consider somebody Jewish, which, whatever one thinks of these issues just normatively, this creates a situation in the Jewish community where there are two different standards of being Jewish, depending on if you happen to walk into your local Reform synagogue or you happen to turn the corner and enter into a Chabad. And so we'll get to all of this in a minute. I wanted to share my screen and we will start our journey through Rabbi Amsalem and Sephardic Judaism. So I want to start off with just a article that was written about Rabbi Amsalem a few years ago. He was called is called the Ben Gurion of the Orthodox, a tolerance preaching rabbi shakes up Israeli politics. And this was written about 16 years ago. And one of the things that we'll get into, 13 years ago. And one of the things that we'll get into is that Chaim Amsalem started off being associated and us actually helping found the political party called Shas. We'll talk a little bit about Shas, but Shas is probably the most important from at least a Sephardic point of view, the most important political development in Israeli history. This happened in the 1980s. We'll talk about that for a few minutes. And he ends up leaving his ultra-Orthodox party Shas, and now he becomes, as this article suggests, a sworn enemy. And so we'll get into that. This will hopefully whet your appetite for a couple of minutes. But let's talk about his biography. Rabbi Amsalem is an Israeli Sephardic rabbi. He is a former member of Knesset. Since he's left the Shas party, he's tried to actually found many new political parties. As at this point, none of them have yet been successful enough to get over the threshold, but we'll discuss some perhaps future projects of his at the end. And he was born in French Algeria in 1959. He actually moved around a lot. He lived for some of his life in actual France, some of his life in Switzerland, but ultimately he was raised in Israel. He served in the Knesset for about 8 years. Someone can fact check my math in real time there. And as I said earlier, even from the 1980s and 1990s, he helped found the party of Shas, which we'll talk about in a few slides. And again, like the article suggests, he became known and is known for challenging and butting back against questions within the Israeli rabbinate and Haredi establishment. And he does this by tapping into what he calls, and not just him, but even going back to other great Sephardic thinkers, like the first chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, Ben Uziel, and the second chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, Ovadia Yosef, which we'll talk about in a second, a more historically rooted Sephardic Judaism. And so not only do we have questions of politics at play, not only do we have questions of Haredi versus, non-Haredi or interdenominational Reform versus Orthodox questions at play, with Haim Amsalem, we also get questions of Sephardi versus Ashkenazi divisions at play, which we'll talk about in a second. And I want to suggest it's actually impossible to understand much of Israeli politics without understanding both the historic and also 20th century divide between the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish community. Part of his inclusivity is emphasizing an integration of Judaism with modernity. And as we'll see, both going back to Ben Uziel, the first Sephardic rabbi of Israel, and also people like Chaim Amsalem, he's going to make the argument that the more authentic way to practice Judaism is actually infusion between modernity and Judaism. And this goes back to a big medieval debate, which we'll talk about in about a slide or two, that happened between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic Jewish community. And so I think I quipped maybe the first week that one of the interesting things about all great Jewish thinkers is that they attempt to make a claim that they have discover the sort of, authentic Judaism, right? And everything else is just, extra historic baggage. And Rabbi Amsalem is going to make an argument in that vein about the fact that Judaism must be combined with modernity. And he even goes so far, and again, for those that understand the divisions within the Haredi community about especially military service, which is also one of the most divisive issues, both currently and in the last generation in Israel, he very much pushes military service. His sons served in the military, and he even goes so far, and I'll sort of give one of his most radical ideas in a second, but he's teased out an idea that suggests that if somebody who is not halachically Jewish serves in the Israeli military, that in and of itself is enough of a acceptance of Judaism that they should actually be eligible for conversion there on the spot. And we'll get to how he gets to these ideas towards the end, but I wanted to throw that out there at the outset. And as I said before, the only way to really understand Rabbi Amsalem, and really the only way to understand Sephardic Judaism writ large, is to start back in medieval, both Spain and then Cairo, to talk about Moses Maimonides, which we will in a second. I also realized, this is a lot of sort of meta points that I'm making here before we really jump in, but we've now seen, this is the fifth thinker that we've seen, and every single thinker, aside from Gershom Scholem, claims to be the heir of Maimonides. So Yeshayahu Lebowitz talks about Maimonides, Leo Strauss talks about Maimonides, David Hartman talks about Maimonides, and Rabbi Amsalem talks a lot about Maimonides. And one of the interesting parts, I think, speaking to the legacy of Maimonides, is that they all speak about Maimonides very differently. They all gain very different conclusions from the person of Maimonides. And so we'll see that in a second. And again, just some of his major focus areas, right? These are all things that we've said before, but conversion, the separation or lack thereof of religion and state in Israel, and also the Sephardic rabbinic tradition. So let's start there. This will probably be a review for almost everybody here. So apologies for the Jewish History 101, but I'll fly through this to get to some of, I think, the more interesting implications. The Jewish world around the 10th century, so think the year 900, was split into two different categories, Ashkenazi and Sephardi. Ashkenaz meaning Germany. These are Jewish communities that over here are in green. Jewish communities that probably came from Babylon. And so if we're just following or tracing of Jewish history, right, if you see where my mouse is here, all the way on the right, modern day Iraq and Iran, that in the ancient world was called Babylonia. This is where the Talmud was written. This is where, once the Talmud was sealed, the great generation of the Geonim. The Geonim were a generation of about 200 years of Jewish, mostly men, who spent their time commentating on the Talmud and developing Jewish law and starting different forms of Jewish literature, such as the Responsa, where Jews all across the world would write them questions and they would come out with these answers and everything like that. Then, starting in the 9th and 10th century, there was political decline in Babylonia, which whenever we have political decline, it also comes with economic decline, which then comes with migration. So Jews started heading out west to the Mediterranean, right? Beautiful area. So some Jews obviously stayed closer to the land of Israel and Egypt. A huge Jewish community started growing in places like Cairo, but then other Jews started going more west. And so you had all of North Africa became a became a major Jewish center, and Jews continued going up to Europe, into modern-day Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, and the vast majority of Jews stopped there. And because Spain ended up becoming the cultural, political, and religious center of this community, they called it the Spanish Jews, otherwise known as Sephardi Jews. Sepharad just means Spain. And everybody in yellow, right, all the Jews who either stayed in Babylonia or stayed in North Africa or came up to Spain but did not go further than Spain, became known as Sephardic Jews. And of course, the other side of this history is Jews probably chasing economic opportunity. According to most historic accounts, this was actually only a couple hundred, at most a couple thousand Jews continued north up the various rivers that go north to south throughout France and Germany, and a small Jewish community started to grow right in the middle of France and Germany, and they became known over the next 1,000 years as Ashkenazi Jews, obviously as political pressures and anti-Semitism and things like the Crusades and pogroms started to arise. Jews continuously moved further east until we get really this major divide, which at least in the 1800s, the vast majority of Jews in the world lived in either the green or the yellow here. And just a couple of facts about Sephardic Jews for our Sephardic Judaism 101. Almost all Sephardic Jews, at least if we take a snapshot of the year 1000, let's go the simplest case, were under Islamic rule. They were protected under what's called dhimmi status, under a pact from the 9th century called the Pact of Umar, which is not equality, right? So it'd be hard to argue that this equated to anything that we would consider to be, equality under the law in a political democracy today. But they did have protected status as second-class citizens. And so the idea was Jews had to pay a special tax. Jews had certain things they weren't allowed to do. But in return for that, Jews generally knew that they were going to have their community protected. This, along with many other historic developments, such as a major school of translation in Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate, started to produce works of philosophy, or more specifically, works that for about 1,000 years nobody had touched. Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus and all of these Greek thinkers that the Christian world decided to very much dampen, right? It's why we call the Christian world often the Dark Ages at this time in Europe, because they didn't want much to do with philosophy that wasn't just pure theology. In the wider Islamic world, there became a increasing climate of intellectualism, otherwise known as philosophy. And the way that I put it to students when I teach this at UCI is all these works were written Greek, right? So if Aristotle and Plato, and very few people spoke Greek at this time, right? If you were in anywhere in the Sephardic Jewish world, you spoke Arabic, of course. And so, how would you have any idea how to engage with Aristotle if you were a nice Jew living in southern Spain in the 11th century? But all of a sudden, this translation school in Baghdad started producing translation after translation. And once a book is translated, it becomes much easier to read. And all of a sudden, the entire Sephardic Jewish world began to be steeped in philosophy, right? Young Jews were showing up to school and coming back home and saying, well, I read Aristotle and I read Plato. And then Jews start to have questions, right? How do you reconcile, Aristotle's idea that the universe was never created, it was just always in existence, with the Jewish idea of creation? And so this sparked a major philosophic boom in Judaism, starting with people like Saadia Gaon, who was the last great rabbi of Baghdad, but more specifically, people like Maimonides spent their entire career attempting to come up with a version of Judaism, or an interpretation of Judaism, that was both Jewish and philosophical, and really trying to fuse both, not saying that one is better than the other, but saying, as Maimonides does, we'll talk about Maimonides a little bit more on the next slide, but Maimonides' key insight is not that philosophy is better than Judaism or Judaism is better than philosophy. It's that without philosophy, you can't actually understand Judaism. In other words, you need both, right? It's the constant, right, what we might call dialectic, right? The playing off between these two sources of knowledge that actually get you to truth. And so there was a general climate of intellectualism that was happening within the Sephardic world. And there was also somewhat of a multicultural experience, right? Jews knew Christians and Muslims. They worked together in places like Spain. There were actually Jews who were elected to political office. There was a Jewish general in Spain in the 11th century that was controlling an army of mostly Muslims. There were Jewish poets. There were Jewish philosophers, right? This was an era of, again, when I say multicultural, this is not, America in the 21st century. But I always joke, if you're going to be reincarnated as a Jew in the year 1000 and you have to pick somewhere, you should pick Spain, right? Spain seemed like it would have been the highest chance for the least amount of persecution and the most amount of both intellectual, economic, and artistic opportunity. And it's not a mistake. I'll just give a fun fact that if we open up the Siddur or the Machzor or, various Jewish prayer books, and you think of, many of the main poems that we have and the songs that we have, right, such as Adon Olam, right? Who doesn't like Adon Olam? I would say 75% of the great poems that we read during liturgy were written in Spain somewhere around the year 1000 to 1300, right? So specifically, Adon Olam was written by a guy named Solomon ibn Gabirol. And he was a well-known both philosopher, he was steeped in Neoplatonism, so he was very influenced by the Greek thinker Plotinus, and he also was a poet, and he attempted to fuse Jewish concepts with new art forms such as poetry, right? Not necessarily that obviously the Tanakh is a little bit of poetry, but a new type of poetry that really is aware of syntax and grammar and all of these things with Greek thought, such as Neoplatonism. And if you open up Adon Olam and read the English translation, the philosophy that Adon Olam is espousing is very different than if you were to open, say, the Talmud or the Tanakh and try to figure out the philosophy that's espousing, right? So this was a multicultural era. And again, this meant that there was more social interaction between the Jewish community and surroundings. And in some sense, this is a stereotype, but in other senses, it's true. So I'm going to name that at the beginning, but I do think this generally holds true, as do most Jewish historians. The Ashkenazi Jews who were north of that, right? So Ashkenaz meaning Germany. So Germany ended up being the center of the Ashkenaz world. Really, it was actually France that was the main center, at least in the 11th and 12th century. They were under Christian rule, and generally that meant that they were under extremely unstable political systems, right? At best, they were under feudal systems where it was up to the whims of whichever, guy happened to own the estate and hired you to be a farmer, or your town was under his jurisdiction, right? If he loved you one day, great, you might have rights. And if he decides the next day that he's very upset with you, there was no centralized government, right? This is obviously before nation states. So there was no federal government to come in and tell you, no, sorry, you're not allowed to just decide to kick out the Jewish farmer that's been on your land for a couple generations. And this also came with oppression, right? Everything we think of the legacy of medieval Christendom, right? With the anti-Semitism and the social isolation that provided. I don't have to go through the list, but Jews were obviously blamed for the death of Jesus, right? The idea that the Jews killed Jesus was a ubiquitous one throughout the Christian Middle Ages. And this meant that any time there was any calamity in society from, say, a plague like the Black Plague, or say in England in the 12th century, if a young boy goes missing and is found dead in the forest, right? The natural consequence was to blame the Jewish community. And this is how many of the anti-Semitic ideas that sadly, are still commonplace in everyday life, many of them can be traced back to the Christian ages of Jews under Christendom, where one, Jews were blamed for obviously the death of Jesus. And so the thinking was, if Jews are willing to kill Jesus, Jews must be willing to commit other evil acts such as, blood libel and starting plagues and things like that. And on the other hand, right, most of us know this just from history, but just to explicate it, Jews were also forced into certain occupations, such as being the lenders and the bankers and the tax collectors, jobs that were seen unethical under Christian view. And of course, nobody likes the guy who shows up to collect the rent every month. And even more so, if the guy who shows up to collect the debts and the rent every month, if he doesn't actually have political protection, what could be a very, almost get rich quick scheme, or if you found yourself in bankruptcy, if you are a feudal leader and you have spent, years borrowing from the local Jewish bank that's in your area, and all of a sudden you realize you can't afford to pay back your debt, you either could, start to fundraise or, go off and sell yourself to work to make money, or you can just have the Jewish banker kicked out of town and killed and destroy the records. And sadly, that second case is what happened a lot more. And so if we think about just before we go to Maimonides, if we think about comparing these two things, the climate of both Ashkenaz and Sephardi could not be more different. So let's talk about Maimonides a minute. Maimonides is perhaps, again, the most singular, influential Jewish philosopher in history. I think I've joked before that the way that a lot of Jewish bookshelves and philosophy are organized is a section of pre-Maimonides Jewish thought and post-Maimonides Jewish thought, because everybody who existed after Maimonides either is basing their philosophy around agreeing with Maimonides and adding to it, or disagreeing with Maimonides and explaining why. And Maimonides, generally, I'm just going to, fast forward his bio a little bit. You can take the time to read it as well. But Maimonides does two things that's going to revolutionize Judaism. And I want to start with actually the second one. I'll come back to his Jewish law in a second. But the first thing that Maimonides does that revolutionizes Judaism is writes a philosophy book very much in the vein of Greek philosophy, right? So one way to think of this is the Torah and the Talmud and the Gaonic literature, they obviously contain arguments, right? The Talmud is full of arguments. Oftentimes the Talmud uses in its legal arguments, premises and conclusions. But before really the Middle Ages, before people like Sajagon, or more so here in this case Maimonides, Jews did not really philosophize. Right? There's no book of pure philosophy. And many scholars point out that the period of the Talmud is about 600 years, right? So we think 1st century to 7th century. But there are no books that are authored by individuals. In other words, everybody who's opened the Talmud knows that there was a rabbi named Rabbi Akiva. We know hundreds of stories about Rabbi Akiva. We know his legal rulings. But Rabbi Akiva never thought to write a book. Right? And if he did, right, we don't have it. And it's not just Rabbi Akiva. We don't have a book from Hillel. We don't have a book from Shammai. We don't have a book from Rabbi Ishmael. We don't have a book from Rabbi Yochanan. And this is sort of strange, right? If we think about a 600-year legacy of Jewish legal intellectualism happening throughout the Talmud, all of these great Jewish leaders, nobody ever thought to sit down and write, a philosophy of Judaism according to Rabbi Akiva, right? It's a strange thing that this never happened. And many scholars try to figure out, why did this happen? And the conclusion that at least some come to is that a pure philosophy was just uninteresting to many of the rabbis of the Talmud. In other words, the rabbis in the Talmud were operating inside of a system, right? The system was Jewish law, and it was almost taken as a given that they would all find Jewish law true and valuable. So then their job was to, within the field of Jewish law, to tease out arguments and to expand it from the inside. Starting in medieval Sephardic community, this was no longer an option, because with the rise of Greek thinking and Aristotle and Plato and the like, and also Islamic philosophy that was budding at this time that was also challenging Judaism, and later on Christian philosophy that was coming in to challenge Judaism, Jewish thinkers were not able to just say, well, let's just focus on the internal aspects of Jewish law. We need to actually defend the entire system of Jewish law. In other words, it's no longer the most pressing Jewish question for a young Sephardic Jew in the year 1180 in Cairo is not going to be questions of, oh my goodness, how do I properly build a sukkah? I totally forgot. Sukkot is in 2 hours. Right? Does there need to be 2 walls or 3 walls? Right? I always forget this. Right? That was no longer the pressing question. The pressing question was, why are we doing this every year? Right? You can almost think of the wicked son on Passover, right? What is the point of this, right? The Greeks aren't doing this. The Christians aren't doing this. The Muslims aren't doing this, right? I go to school in Cairo and I'm, in a multicultural area and none of my classmates are doing this. They seem like reasonably smart people and not, crazy, immoral barbarians, right? So why are we doing all these Jewish things and why are they not? And this gave rise to a unique need in the Sephardic world for Jewish philosophy, right? What is philosophy but a systematic inquiry into why are we doing the things that we're doing? And as many scholars point out, this only actually could have arisen within a type of multicultural climate, because if we compare to the Ashkenazi community, right, the Ashkenazi community was, one, they were so isolated, right? So unlike our Cairo counterpart, if you're a Jew in Paris in the year 1180, you're probably not going to school with people of other religious backgrounds, right? Greek philosophy had not made it into the wider Christian world in the early 12th century. And so you're not dealing with those ideas from there. And more so, your community's under constant social isolation and pressure. And, well, we know far too well from recent anti-Semitism what happens to a community when a community feels like it's undergoing external pressure. They become more insular. They circle the wagons, right? They begin to have less to do with the outside world and more just to do with their own kind, right? Perhaps some of us, right? I know definitely, many college students in the last few years have told me since October 7th, they just have a lot more Jewish friends and a lot fewer non-Jewish friends. And this is very much what happened in the Ashkenazi community. So unlike the Sephardic community that was forced to philosophize and to come up with these great works of philosophy, the Ashkenazi community, it was business as usual. But business as usual meaning Jews continuing the tradition of the Talmud. And we'll talk about this in a little bit on the next slide. But just to drive this point home, so Maimonides writes a book called The Guide to the Perplexed, where he makes two main arguments. I won't, it'll take, 10 AOI classes to go through all of his arguments. I won't do that. But one, Judaism allows for engagement with philosophy, and his more radical claim, the Torah is only understandable via philosophy. In other words, for Maimonides, if you do not study philosophy, you are actually unable to understand the Torah. And this is a pretty radical claim. What this means, and you can kind of hear echoes in this, how I introduced Rabbi Amsalem's thinking about the need for both Judaism and modernity, is that if you only take Judaism, right, if you only have Torah, and you don't combine that with the ideas of philosophy, or today we would call it science and ethics and politics and things that aren't necessarily just Jewish, you actually are unable to understand Torah. The other thing that Maimonides does, and I'll just flag this in case people are interested to come back to this in 20 minutes during the Q&A at the end, is Maimonides is going to become a part of a long line of only Sephardic thinkers, right, in the Middle Ages, who, because of everything we've been talking about, begin to codify Jewish law. One note about this. For those that have studied Talmud before, which I think I've personally studied at least some Talmud with almost everybody in the Zoom call, so I'm going to assume it's a very high percentage of people here. The Talmud is process-oriented. It's not conclusion-oriented. What this means is the Talmud deals with multiple opinions. The Talmud preserves argumentation, and oftentimes the Talmud does not end by saying, and you follow the ruling of Shirley, right? Because Shirley's right. Oftentimes the Talmud will have a 3-page debate between 3 people, and then it'll just end, and you won't know what to do, right? It's almost as if the Talmud was not meant to be a practical book of Jewish law. The Talmud was meant to be something else, right? Something broader than that. In the Sephardic Jewish community, starting with a rabbi named Rabbi Isaac Alfasi in Fez, but more so with Maimonides and the Mishnah Torah, Jewish leaders in the Sephardic community began to think about Jewish law as statutory law, right? What's statutory law? It's just a book of what to do, right? And so Maimonides is almost making the argument, and he explicitly makes this in his introduction to his legal code, the Mishnah Torah, that a Jew that's trying to figure out, how to be Jewish in the world doesn't actually need the Talmud anymore, right? It's sort of a radical statement to make. You can read the introduction to the Mishnah Torah if you don't believe me. But Maimonides explicitly says, I have written this book, right? Mishnah literally means second, right? From the Hebrew word sheni, right? So I have written this book, the secondary to the Torah. I'm paraphrasing Maimonides, because all a young Jew needs to understand, what to do is they need the Bible, right? The Torah, and my book, the Mishnah Torah, and nothing in between, right? You don't need the Talmud, you don't need the Geonim, you don't need all of that. And Maimonides puts this out, right? Obviously, it became quite controversial for its time. It sparked an 1,000-year Jewish debate about legal codes. But the Sephardic tradition viewed law in a much more practical and pragmatic way, because when law is underpinned by other things, law does not become the center of your universe, right? Another way to say this is your average Sephardic Jew, even very religious, what we would consider to be very traditional Sephardic Jew in the year 1180, was both steeped in Bible, right? Tanakh, was steeped in poetry, was steeped in philosophy, and, kept Jewish law, because that's what Jews did. Your average Ashkenazi Jew was not steeped in poetry, was not steeped in philosophy, was not, to the extent that they were steeped in Bible, it was through the eyes of the Talmud, right? In other words, Rashi, who wrote the most famous commentary on the Talmud, right, still to this day perhaps, Rashi is not trying to understand what is the Torah saying at face value. Rashi is offering a commentary on the Torah as reflected through the eyes of the Talmudic tradition, right? So Rashi wants more Talmud, and Maimonides wants less Talmud. And this is, again, going to have major repercussions as well. I'm going to fly through this because I see class time is I'm already at halfway here, and I won't tell you how many slides I have here because it's a lot. But the Jews of Ashkenaz, right, they were under a completely different social paradigm. And I said before, right, you could think of this as, right, much less intellectual freedom. No philosophy. The Christian world had explicit heresy laws, not just for other Christians, but for Jews. And this also came along with, what scholars call anti-Judaism. They don't use the term anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism implies racial, right? You don't like Jews because of their race. This is much more what we would call anti-Judaism, right? They didn't like Jews because of our religion. And again, we can kind of go down the list of all the things that I've mentioned before. I don't have to read this all for us to hear today. And the most important thing to understand about the Ashkenazi community is that the Ashkenazi community was much more inward looking than the Sephardic counterparts. And the two obvious examples, I mentioned Rashi before. What does Rashi do, right? Rashi's contribution to Jewish scholarship. One, he writes his commentary on the Torah, right, giving it a philosophy, right? He brings the Talmud and the Midrash, right, another work that was produced at the same time as the Talmud. He brings that to life for the average Jew, because now when you open up your weekly parsha, right, in shul, or if you're studying it on, Tuesday night with some friends, you're not just reading the verses verse by verse and trying to figure out what does it mean. You're seeing what Rashi has to say about it, and what Rashi is saying about it is what the Midrash and Talmud said about it. So it's a way of increasing familiarity with the Talmud and Midrash, right, to the point where now, right, in the mainstream Ashkenazi community, many people are actually oftentimes confused that certain ideas that they could have sworn are in the Torah aren't actually in the Torah. And then you have conversations with them and you say, well, you're probably quoting Rashi. And then you look and they're quoting Rashi, and they had no idea that this wider idea that they had always believed was certainly in the Torah isn't actually in the Torah. It's in a midrash that was then commented in by Rashi. The second thing that Rashi does, that's perhaps even more important, is Rashi writes an encyclopedic commentary on the Talmud. One of the ways to think about this, and this is the analogy that I gave in class 2 weeks ago, and all the students liked it, so I'll try it here. If you've ever tried to read Shakespeare, and assuming you're not a Shakespearean scholar, it's a pretty difficult thing to do because Shakespeare is writing in a very different type of English than any of us speak. And so you have a couple of options if you want to study Shakespeare. One, you can decide not to study Shakespeare. I'm guessing that's most people's approach to Shakespeare today. And the second is you could spend hours trying to get through a couple pages of Shakespeare and dedicating a lot of time and intellectual effort to Shakespeare. Perhaps if you really are interested in Shakespeare, you can get a tutor that comes or you can sign up for a private class to help you understand Shakespeare, right? But that costs a lot of time and resources, and you have to be quite smart to be able to do that. The third, which is now the most common way, at least high schoolers and college students study Shakespeare, is they have websites such as SparkNotes, and you can open it and it gives translations of Shakespeare in modern English, right? And so you could go line by line and you can read a scholar's translation. Again, Shakespeare is obviously still in English, but it's in Old English. A scholar will have gone line by line and will translate Shakespearean English into modern day English. And then it takes you, 10 minutes to read through a couple pages of Shakespeare as opposed to hours. We can debate the pros and cons of this model, but this is what Rashi does to the Talmud. Before Rashi's time, if you wanted to study Talmud anywhere in the Jewish world, whether you were Ashkenazi or Sephardi, you had to go to a special academy, perhaps you had to travel away from home, or your family had to be rich enough to hire a personal tutor that would come, that would teach you Talmudic Aramaic, right? Jews did not speak Aramaic in France in the 11th century. Jews did not speak Aramaic in Spain in the 11th century. And so you wanted to learn this, strange foreign language, right? You had to go to an expert, right? Obviously, this is before, the internet, and this is before, Jastrow translation of the Talmud. And so Rashi really came up with the first either dictionary, if you think of it, or translation of the Talmud into a different language, right? He essentially translates the Talmud, right? We oftentimes don't think of Rashi's commentary as a translation because it's a commentary, but really Rashi translates the Talmud into a easy to digest Hebrew and also French, right? Rashi actually adds in a lot of French commentary. Oftentimes when Rashi is translating a word in the Talmud, he doesn't just interpret it into Hebrew. He interprets it into French, right? It'd be the same thing as if I was translating the Talmud for a popular audience and I was translating it into English. And Rashi does this to democratize Talmudic scholarship. And so Rashi is driving home the point Jews need more Talmud. And this goes even to the next gear. Again, I won't I spend more than 20 seconds on this, but Rashi's school, right, both his sons and his intellectual, children, come up with a school of thought called Tosafot. Tosafot, for those Hebrew speakers among us, just means more, right? And so Tosafot essentially just did Talmud to the Talmud. And so the way to think about it is the same way the Talmud will make simple things much more complicated, right? You have a simple verse in the Torah, and somehow the Talmud spends 6 pages dissecting it and coming up with questions and contradictions and adding to the Talmudic process. Tosfot goes line by line of the Talmud and does the same thing. Tosfot adds more to the Talmud, right? He's expanding the Talmudic tradition. So while you have the Ashkenazi community that is inwardly, that is becoming internal in the law, and according to the great scholar and historian of Jewish law, Chaim Soloveitchik, he has a famous essay where he talks about martyrdom. I won't go into that now, but if you're interested, ask me in 20 minutes or hang out a little bit after the Zoom call. But his wider point, which is one that holds, is that the Ashkenazi Jewish community, because they were so inward looking as opposed to exward looking, added to the law. In other words, the Ashkenazi medieval conception of Jewish law became much wider than the Sephardic Jewish tradition, right? 2 examples. One, I think you'll all intuitively understand. The other might be a little bit less intuitive. But the first one is what makes a kitchen kosher, right? You can debate this, for hundreds of years, and Jews have been debating this for hundreds of years. But the Talmud actually makes it quite easy to have a kosher kitchen. The Talmud actually entertains cases of your roommate bakes a pig in the same oven that you are making your steak for Shabbat. Is it kosher? And the Talmud is willing to say, yes, there actually are times that's kosher. I can promise you any Jew, right, that grew up in a kosher kitchen that ever suggested that they can bake pork in the same oven as their kosher chicken for Shabbat would have been chased out of the house. So what accounts for this discrepancy? So Chaim Soloveitchik argues that the Ashkenazi medieval tradition, right, when all day you spend thinking about law internally, halacha, things are going to get stricter. And so the Ashkenazi community becomes increasingly stricter in their practice of many areas of Jewish law. The second that you'll all intuitively get is this thing called kitniot that the Ashkenazi community does as well, right? What is kitniot? Kitniot is a certain genre of food that the Ashkenazi community doesn't eat on Passover. And this includes legumes and beans and rice and everything there. And it's actually quite easy to eat a kosher for Passover diet if you don't care about kitniot, right? You just don't eat bread for a couple of days, right? That's not a big deal. Keeping Ashkenazi, right, traditional Ashkenazi Passover, that is very difficult because everything today has either canola oil or corn syrup or something like that as well. And so you can kind of even think about the differences there as well. So how did this all affect Chaim Amsalem? We can kind of start to narrow down our history into the 20th century. I'll tell one more historic story on the way before we can understand the intersection of all of these forces into modern day Jewish community. Judaism in the modern period became Ashkenazi dominant. And it was the Ashkenazi community that produced many of the movement of the 19th and 20th century in the Jewish community. So if we think about Reform Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, Zionism, Jewish socialism, known as the Bund, right? Any ism in the Jewish community or movement or denomination sprang from the Ashkenazi world. This has to do with the Enlightenment. We've discussed this in previous classes, so I won't go too far into that. At this point, much of the Sephardic world, right, the Jews who were still living in places like North Africa and the Middle East. Jews were kicked out of Spain in the 15th century, so I'll flag that for listeners. So the main center of the Sephardic world was destroyed during the expulsion from Spain in the Spanish Inquisition, but much of the Sephardic Jews ended up going to North Africa or the Middle East, taking refuge in the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. And in some way, in many of our thinking about Jewish history, whenever thinking about Jewish history from, say, the year 1700 to the year 2000, let's just give a neat 300 years, their default is going to be to talk about Ashkenazi Jewish history, right? It's Ashkenazi Jewish history that has the Enlightenment, Ashkenazi Jewish history that has the Haskalah, Ashkenazi Jewish history that has all these debates about Reform Judaism versus conservative versus Orthodox. It's Ashkenazi Judaism that is at the center of the Zionist movement. It's Ashkenazi Judaism that is the main Jewish community in America because of immigration from the Eastern European pogroms. It's obviously Ashkenazi community that bears the 99% of the brunt of the Holocaust that happened in the 1930s and 40s. And so oftentimes we think of Judaism today as Ashkenazi Judaism. And the two main centers of Jewish community by the mid-20th century, America and Israel, became very dominated by the Ashkenazi community, right? America, it's obvious, right? The vast, vast, vast majority of Jews in America, even still today, are Ashkenazi. And if you think about what it means to have a Jewish institution, right? Generally, if you were to say, a synagogue or a Jewish market or a Jewish, institution, our default in America is going to be to assume that it's an Ashkenazi institution or market or synagogue. In Israel, it was still the case in the 1940s and 50s that this is the case. But all of a sudden, Jews from Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Tunisia, Syria start pouring into Israel, right? There's a whole interesting history as to how they got there. Some of it has to do with them being, forcibly pushed out in reaction to both the state of Israel and the Six-Day War. But all of a sudden in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, Israel began to absorb hundreds of thousands of Sephardic Jews, and at that point they started to be called Mizrahi Jews, right? Mizrahi, unlike Sephardic Jews, which talks about this geographic differentiation between Ashkenazi and Sepharad, Mizrahi became much more a political denominator. In other words, to call somebody a Mizrahi Jew simply meant that they were not coming from the Ashkenazi world to Israel in the 20th century. And just to talk a little bit, I'm going to fast forward through this debate about how they actually ended up leaving Israel. But when the Mizrahi Jews got to Israel, they faced an Ashkenazi community that was hegemonic, right? Hegemonic just means they were in control of all the resources, right? If we think about the school system in Israel, the education system in Israel, Israel has no separation of church and state. So if we think about the major, policies of Israel vis-a-vis questions of Jewishness, it was all controlled by the Ashkenazi Jewish community. And especially at the beginning of the founding of the state of Israel, the Ashkenazi community in Israel was extremely secular, right? They were liberal, they were European, and they actually looked down upon Jews who were more religious. And so when many Mizrahi refugees start to pour into Israel, they are treated very badly by the Ashkenazi mainstream in Israel. One, right, and there's a couple of reasons for this, but one way to think of this is the Ashkenazi Zionists, right, in some way, the Zionist identity was antithetical to a religious Jewish identity. I think we've talked about before, much of the underwhelming philosophy of political Zionism is we are not the religious Jews who are sitting around in Europe, waiting for God to bail us out. We are the new Jew. We're strong. We can fight for ourselves. We don't need God and we don't need prayer and all this. We need to plow the field and to learn how to shoot guns. And so all of a sudden that hundreds of thousands of Mizrahi Jews are coming in, they're viewed as too religious, as too traditional, right? All of these things. And so there was this paternalistic sentiment that started to push down on the Mizrahi community. And at the same time, the Ashkenazi community viewed their mission, and again, one can debate whether or not this is good or bad, but created an educational system and a social system in Israel that can be summarized by Ben-Gurion's quote down here. I'll get to all these other bullet points in a second. But David Ben-Gurion writes in the 1950s, he said, in Israel, efforts must be made to increase shared and unifying properties and eliminate as far as possible those that separate and divide. We must strengthen the common denominator of our people, not multiply distinctions and sectarian divisions. So like a good, socialist, influenced by socialist, labor leader, David Ben-Gurion suggests that all of these different debates, right, the religious versus secular, the Eurocentric view versus Middle Eastern view, right, the traditional versus, socialist, all of these debates, Israeli society is not actually stronger when it has this diversity. Israeli society, in order for it to thrive, needs to all be one thing, right? It needs to be a group of people that are totally united under the banner of Israel and Zionism and fighting for building a state. Now, again, I think there is a really interesting side conversation to have about whether or not this is a fair view or not, right? Because for the first 20 or 30 years of Israel, it really was a all hands on deck situation where you did need everybody working towards one common goal. On the other hand, this came with many what we would call today racist policies towards the Mizrahi Jewish community. And there was an attempt to quite literally to re-educate them according to, what a nice, according the Zionistic viewpoint, what a nice, elite, European, more secular education system would have there. And one of the people to break this mold, and this is probably at least understanding the rise of Amsalem. This will be the last slide I do before drilling down on Haim Amsalem's thinking. I was just when I was preparing this yesterday, I was thinking to myself, there's no chance there's any hope at understanding, the radical nature of what somebody like Amsalem is doing without understanding all these different forces coming together. But my favorite fun fact question to American Jews, and I think I might have even mentioned this before, but what is the most attended funeral in Jewish history? It's a great question because, only 1% of people actually get the question right. People say, Theodor Herzl, or maybe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe is one that I've heard a lot, right? Some people might go, a little bit back in history, maybe Maimonides, right? You can have a lot of interesting guesses as to who the most attended funeral was in Jewish history. The correct answer is Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. Which at that point, again, if I'm talking to mostly non-Orthodox Jewish undergraduate students, they say who, and they take out their phone and Google him because they've never heard of the person that was the most attended funeral in Jewish history. So who was Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and why is he important to our story? So he was born in Iraq in the 1920s. He ended up moving to Israel. He lived 93 years in the state of Israel, and he becomes known as the most important Sephardic legal thinker, right? Here I put all time, but really in the modern era, right? It's hard to think of, him as more important than Maimonides, but he was the most important Sephardic legal mind post-expulsion from Spain. In 1970, he becomes the chief rabbi of Israel, and in 1980s, he, along with many of his students, one of those students is Haim Amsalem, founds a political party called Shas. Shas is the exact opposite of what the secular Ashkenazi community was attempting to do with the Mizrahi community in the 1950s and 60s. Shas is a religious party, right? Today we would call it ultra-Orthodox, but it's important to distinguish it from the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox community called United Torah Judaism. So yes, ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi and ultra-Orthodox Sephardi Jews vote for different political parties. So one, it is ultra-Orthodox. Two, it is deeply at its center, it involves Mizrahi rights and Mizrahi liberation. And there's a lot of interesting writing on this, that in the 1970s and 80s, the Mizrahi community in Israel went through a process where you can almost think of it as akin to the Black Power movement or Black Panthers in America, where it was a Mizrahi rights, almost like a much, much, much smaller scale version of the civil rights movement of Sephardic Jewish thinkers coming out and saying, it's too long that we're viewed as, second class by a whole variety of functions. We need to accumulate political power. We need to attempt to challenge the Ashkenazi hegemony. The Shas party became responsible for the flipping of Israeli politics from labor to Likud, right? One way to think of this is for the first 30 or 40 something years of Israel, all of the leaders were from the left-wing party Labor. So if we think of all the first 6 prime ministers of Israel, they're all coming from the left. And right-wing prime ministers were viewed as beyond the pale, right? So if we think of somebody like Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin was the first right-wing prime minister of Israel. Menachem Begin was considered a terrorist by the early labor Zionist leaders because in the pre-state Yishuv, right, the pre-state Zionist settlement, there was the main army called the Haganah, right? The Haganah just means the defensive army, right? It eventually became the IDF. But there was another army named the Irgun, right, or Etzel, and that was led by a guy named Menachem Begin, and this army was a rival army to the Haganah. They disagreed in politics, they disagreed in their approach, they almost ended up, having some battles many times, right? This is a whole other interesting episode of Israeli history, but Menachem Begin, at the founding of the state, was viewed as, beyond the pale of what should be accepted in politics. Menachem Begin ends up becoming prime minister in the 1980s, and he does so by teaming up with many young, disaffected Mizrahi Jews. And one of his main claims in his campaign is going to be, these secular elite Ashkenazis all live in these nice kibbutzim with these nice fancy swimming pools. And, they say they're socialists, but really they're just amassing all the money for themselves. And they've treated you, the young Mizrahi Jew, badly. I'm going to be your champion, right? I'm more traditional. Menachem Begin was much more traditionally religious than the labor leaders. And an entirely new era of Israeli politics came into being in the 1980s because of people like Menachem Begin harnessing the power of a much younger, more religious, politically motivated Sephardic community as well, again, built on issues like Sephardic pride and such. Ovadia Yosef also, the last thing I'll say about Ovadia Yosef, and then we'll conclude with 10 minutes on Haim Amsalem, is Ovadia Yosef is not content on just doing this in the political arena, but one of the reasons why he's the most important Sephardic legal thinker of modernity is he spends his time pushing back on Ashkenazi halachic hegemony. And the most important case to understand in Israeli history about this has to do with the question of whether or not Jews from Ethiopia are considered Jewish. Just to summarize this debate in 2 minutes, I'm not going to do this justice, but I guess the point of this class was maybe to whet your appetite to deep dive into one of the 30 topics that I've spent 30 seconds on. So apologies for that. It's like all good Jewish classes. Here's one idea, and then go out and learn. The rest is commentary. But there were 60 to 100,000, again, different accounts differ, Jews that were living in Ethiopia in the mid to late 20th century. I believe this is the 1970s. And there was a civil war that happened in Ethiopia, and the Jews there were in trouble. And so Israel was trying to figure out a way to rescue the Jews from Ethiopia. And there were, some fascinating Mossad operations in this regard. But this then sparked a debate within the mainstream Israeli Orthodox community of whether or not the Jews in Ethiopia are actually Jewish or not. There's a little bit of a complicated history there, and within this complicated history was the idea that was pushed by many leading Ashkenazi rabbis that perhaps the Ethiopian Jewish community, you can't actually trust their Jewishness because in the 1800s there was a series of Christian missionaries that went to Ethiopia trying to convert the Jewish community there, and many of the Ethiopian Jewish practices didn't really look the same way that we practice Judaism in Israel. For one, they were very non-Talmudic, and so the community in Ethiopia did not rule according to the Talmud, according to most Jewish laws, and even more so, in some of the communities, there were some practices that almost mixed Judaism and Christianity to the point where many of the Ashkenazi rabbis were saying, we don't know if the Ethiopian Jews should really be considered Jewish. So this is not just the question of, once they're in Israel, do you give them the full rights of a Jew? In other words, obviously, for those that know Israeli law, in order to get married by the Rabbanut in Israel, you have to be halakhically Jewish, right? There's a lot of political repercussions of being Jewish, but also the wider question of, should Israel spend its resources to help Ethiopian Jews escape Ethiopia? And this is an issue that very much divided the Israeli community. And the chief Ashkenazi rabbi, Rav Kook, said no. In other words, Rav Kook said, the Ethiopian Jews, we cannot be sure that they're Jewish. And so if they come to Israel, we need to make sure that they convert, right? Something about them seems fishy. We're not going to declare them Jewish. Ovadia Yosef pushes back against this extremely hard. He both politically rallies supporters to push the Israeli government to rescue Ethiopian Jews, and he issues great halachic decisions saying, of course, the Ethiopian Jews are Jewish, right? Don't think otherwise. And he writes this according, in a series of very strong essays. So fast forward to I'll just go through. These are all the slides that if this class was 2 hours, we could have got through. So fast forward to somebody like Haim Amsalem, and I want to focus mostly on conversion because, as I said at the beginning, I think conversion is the biggest question that in the Jewish community that nobody talks about. Obviously, this was one of the key political and religious debates between Ovadia Yosef, right, the chief Sephardic rabbi, and the Ashkenazi rabbi. And Chaim Amsalem writes a lot about this question of conversion. And so a couple of ideas there, and then I'll leave off with one core idea, and then we can have a little bit of a conversation at the end. Chaim Amsalem is going to become famous, and this actually explains his separation from much of the Haredi world or the ultra-Orthodox world, by suggesting that there should be a more lenient and humane conversion process rooted in classical Sephardi halacha. You would not have understood this line 50 minutes ago, I'm guessing, but now that we understand the difference between Maimonides and Tosfot, right? Maimonides was content on making law a lot more simple, right? The point of the Mishnah Torah was to simplify Jewish law, not add to its complexity. And so a return to the classical Sephardic tradition by Chaim Amsalem is saying, whereas Tosfot and Rashi and the Ashkenazi Jews spent much of their time coming up with what he calls chumrot, or stringencies, the Sephardic tradition historically has been trying to have a very simple approach to Jewish law, right? A much more human-centric approach, one that takes outside ideas into account, right? If you're steeped in philosophy and poetry and science, you're going to be more likely to take in other forms of wisdom into your account than if your whole life is just insular, internal within the law. Second, he wants to reclaim conversion from institutions. So one of the big problems in modern day Israel that Chaim Amsalem has spent a lot of time railing against is that conversion, which historically in the Jewish community was done in much more a democratic way. In other words, any rabbi of a synagogue, right, if we think of how the Jewish community functioned in the 1600s in Poland or the 1600s in Syria, the Jewish community had a rabbi, and that rabbi would be in charge of, converts to and from the, to the Jewish community. And, there'd be different standards, and the rabbi would, again, probably use some mixture of his knowledge of Jewish law, but also, sociologic realities to figure out, who should be a member of the Jewish community and who shouldn't. With the state of Israel, this became politicized and nationalized. And now there are big centralized institutions, this is also true in America, but let's focus on Israel for a minute, that controls conversion. In other words, in Israel, for you to be considered Jewish according to the state, it's no longer okay to go to your local rabbi, Orthodox or not, and have them convert you. You have to go through the Rabbanut, right, the Israeli rabbinate, often, or not often, always controlled by the ultra-Orthodox community. And their standards for conversion are many, many, many more levels stricter than the levels for conversion that would have been around in the Jewish community, say, 400 years ago. And people like Rabbi Amsalem have been pushing within Israel, within both the Haredi community and wider Israeli political sphere, to come up with an independent court system that's run according to actual Jewish law as opposed to politicized Jewish law. And he's issued a number of hypothetical, or he's offered a number of hypothetical ways to view this, which is one, he has a famous book called Zera Yisrael, where he makes the argument that if somebody is a patrilineal Jew, in other words, if somebody has a Jewish father and non-Jewish mother, according to the Orthodox community, the mainstream Orthodox community, the answer is that person is just not Jewish, right? If they want to convert, they have to do a full conversion. Rav Amsalem has said there are two different categories of what we mean when we say somebody's Jewish. There is halachically Jewish, and there is, I'll translate to ethnically Jewish, right? Zera literally means the seed of, right? It's actually a line in the book of Ezra, where Ezra talks about the Jewish seed when the Jews are coming from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild the second temple. That's a whole other class that we can spend on this story. But for Rav Amsalem, he is going to reclaim a Jewish identity that's non-halachic at its source and go so far as to say, if somebody is a product of Zeri Yisrael, in other words, if an Israeli or a Jew has Jewish ancestry, they should have a streamlined process to becoming Jewish. They don't need to jump through all the hoops. They don't need to spend, 2 or 3 years showing their dedication to Judaism by keeping every, minute jot and tittle of Jewish law, as is the case in the Orthodox conversion system currently. But they should just have some general questionnaire of, are you committed to the Jewish people? Do you see yourself as Jewish? All of these. Are you currently practicing another religion? No, great. Okay, you're Jewish, right? Maybe dunk them in a mikvah or do circumcision if they hadn't had that, but essentially a much quicker, streamlined version for conversion. And I even said before, he even floated the idea that participation in military service can demonstrate what one would call Kabbalat HaMitzvot, right? And this will be the thing that I end on, right? Much of the debate about conversion deals with this line in the Gemara, right? The Gemara says, right, the Talmud says that in order for somebody to be accepted as a convert, they need to have Kabbalat HaMitzvot, right? Kabbalah just means acceptance, mitzvot are commandments. So for somebody to convert, they need to have an acceptance of the commandments. Now, the mainstream Orthodox community, certainly in Israel, but also in America, interprets this to mean all of the mitzvot. In other words, if you are going to eat a cheeseburger, sorry, you're not eligible. If you're going to get in a car on Shabbat, sorry, you're not eligible. If you are not going to have separate dishes for meat and milk, sorry, not eligible. If you're not going to dress according to Orthodox modesty standards, sorry, you're not eligible, right? You can go down the list. And if somebody wants to convert, the Orthodox standard is to say, you have to keep every single mitzvah, right? All of them. That is a very difficult standard. Even in the modern Orthodox community in America, most people do not practice Judaism at a level high enough that they would be accepted as converts. There's another way to interpret this, which is the way that Haim Amsalem interprets this, which is the way that he set up many different platforms and institutions called Ahavat HaGer, to attempt to streamline this based on an interpretation of Kabbalat HaMitzvot, which says this is not talking about a specific every single mitzvah, go down the list. This is a general paradigm. In other words, generally, if you're converting to Judaism, do you generally accept a acceptance of the commandments of Judaism on you, right? We're not going to look through every single list. We're not going to make sure you do everything to the T. But again, by becoming a part of the Jewish people, you generally become under the yoke of Jewish law and commandments. And again, rather than this being specific, go down the list, this is just, are you generally committed to this way of life? In which case, somebody who's not halakhically Jewish, but say serves in the Israeli military for 3 years, according to a radical interpretation of this view, could suggest, yes, if you're giving up 3 years of your life to serve the Jewish people in the Israeli army, that is enough of a acceptance of the commandments for you to be considered Jewish. And right now, again, I had mentioned this at the outset, that of all the thinkers that we've had before, Chaim Amsalem is both the only one who's still alive and also the least well-known one. I'm guessing many people hadn't heard of him. I actually really only became aware of him a few months ago. I was recording a podcast with Rabbi Daniel Buskila, who is the head of the Israeli Sephardic Center. And he's done a lot of work with Chaim Amsalem as well on a lot of these issues of fronting the more traditional Sephardic Jewish tradition as a way to counteract many of the Ashkenazi stringencies that have happened in the last 100 plus years. And I said, my optimistic hope for 50 years from now is that he is viewed in the pantheon of great Jewish thinkers, because I do firmly believe that this question of Jewish identity and conversion and all these questions, especially within Israel, but even within America, are some of the most heated and divisive issues that are involved in the Jewish community. And it's nice to know that there are, great, wise, Talmidei Chachamim, right, Jewish scholars like Chaim Amsalem who are working on this. So thank you all. I'm happy to, I know that we went 7 minutes extra, so I'm happy to take a couple of questions, and I think Rabbi Marsha wanted to close, but Dylan, go for it.
Hey, Rabbi Daniel. Great conversation today. This is it's very timely, we'll say. And something that I thought of when you were on the last slide was, um, a lot of the times, like, especially like in the Orthodoxy, I'll hear is like nothing in Torah is by accident, right? Torah is written in a specific way. And so I just wondered if you might speak on that as like, it doesn't say to follow all the commandments, right? It just gives this kind of vague, accept the commandments. And right. So I just wonder maybe if you could speak on that a little bit. I just thought that was kind of an um, interesting thing.
Yeah, 100%. So we'll try to do this in 2 minutes, and then I'm happy to obviously have a longer conversation. So much of our laws of conversion come from the book of Ruth, right? That we read, we'll read it in 2 weeks on Shavuot. Ruth makes it very easy to, right? If all you know is the book of Ruth, you would think converting to Judaism takes 25 seconds. I mean, real commitment, but a very quick process, right? Ruth, literally all she says is, your people are my people, your God is my God, where you go, I will go, I will follow you until death do us part, right? That took me what, 15 seconds, right? Ruth was obviously authentic in her conversion to Judaism, but it seems like in ancient times this was, very easy, to convert to Judaism. Again, the process of converting, not the ideologic commitment, right? But it seemed like once you had commitment to the Jewish people, you were considered converting. The Talmud spends a little bit of time on the laws of conversion, but actually the Talmud spends a lot less time talking about conversion than one would think. The Talmud says in order for somebody to be a convert, right, first you have to teach them laws. The Talmud says you teach them some of the big laws and some of the small laws, and then if they accept the laws, they can be converted. So the traditional interpretation of some big laws and some small laws is that this means you have to keep every law, right? You start off by teaching them some of the laws, but the idea is that they eventually have to, learn about all the laws and keep all the laws. The alternative interpretation is what I said before, that this is just saying like, no, of course, if somebody's converting to Judaism, they have to have an awareness of, many of the main laws, and they have to generally buy into the framework, but it doesn't have to be, 100% of every single thing in every single context. And so this in many ways is the big debate there as well. And I see Rosalind asked if there's any other Orthodox rabbis that currently support this. So yes, not a lot, but there are other rabbis who are supporting this endeavor. And again, there's a gradient. There's a spectrum. And when I say by there's a spectrum, meaning there are many rabbis in Israel on a whole variety of issues, Orthodox rabbis, that are upset at the rabbanut's control over certain areas of life, right? So I'll give some less controversial ones, right? Kashrut standards or marriage standards, right? So there have been other institutions that have popped up, right? One of them called Sohar, right? It's a group of Orthodox rabbis, but that are attempting to say, you don't need, there can be more than one right way to make something kosher, right? The same way in America, right? We have pure separation of church and state. So all kashrut industries in America, right, are private businesses, right? You can decide what you trust, right? So, maybe one person will decide that Hebrew National hot dogs are kosher, and another person says it's not a strict enough, it's not a strict enough hechsher for me. But those are private, as a private citizen, I can, consume whatever I want. And as a private corporation, if you own a kashrut organization, you can decide what your standards are and what you want to give it. And it's very much, a free market of kosher, right? You can kind of think of it like that. Israel, there is no separation of church and state. And so the rabbanut is nationalized. It's politicized, right? It's paid for by the government. It's a governmental arm. And they are in charge of deciding what is kosher and not. And to people like, Chaim Amsalem, and this is many others. He has many other allies in the Orthodox community on this issue. Oftentimes, the rabbinate or the rabbanut in Israel will make decisions not based off of pure halacha. They'll make decisions based on some mixture of pure halacha and politics. And so, if you want to know if something's actually just kosher without all the political baggage, there should be an additional kashrut, agency, and one of them is called Sohar that I mentioned before, that's starting to give their hechsher to different products in Israel. So this is currently a battle, an ideologic battle that's taking place in Israel as well. And conversion is just one arm of this. So great question. So I said before, I will close with this that basically every single one of these ideas I think could be any bullet point could have been an entire class in and of itself. So I thank you all for coming for the last 5 sessions. Thank you, Rabbi Marsha, for hosting me, and I think Rabbi Marsha just wanted to close out
Yes. Oh,
our.
I, I hope you can hear me. I'm sort of in a sketchy cell zone, but I want to thank everybody for coming. Yet, what a wonderful presentation. You'll um you'll all be receiving a little survey about this 5-week course, and I hope you'll fill it out and respond. It'll be very helpful to us. We'd love to know um what I'm sure we all enjoyed it, but what resonated for you and what not. So please look for that in the coming week, and want to wish you all a beautiful rest of the Omer and a great Shavuot. Hopefully, we'll see you on May 18th. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank
If
you.
anyone wants in the
Thank
next
you.
remarks, just give me 30 seconds. I'll throw in if anybody wants to hear this conversation that I had with Daniel Busquila, where we talk a little bit more about all these ideas. I will throw that link in the chat here. And have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you very much.